深夜1時、叫びながら突っ走る狂乱状態の男性が目撃され、そのまま路地裏に消え去った。翌日、その姿を見つけた人が、最初は変死体が肉の塊にしか見えなかったと証言した。巷の話では、噂の呪いが新たな犠牲者を食らったという、うさんくさい話だな。
Dunno, sounds plausible to me.
いや、どう考えても不自然すぎるでしょう。そもそも、このサイトの名前から考えたら即アウトでしょうよ。ゴワゴワタイムスって読者をバカにしてるの。誰が触っていいと言ったの。あら、優しい呪いさんだったんだ。
Right, Rui wa Tomo o Yobu. You know, I have this sort of tradition where I like to start the year playing a highly rated VN. A kamigi, if you will. Last year was Gunjo no Sora o Koete, and this year is Rui Tomo's turn. I honestly knew very little about it, other than this very feminine protagonist actually being a boy. Yep, not kidding there. This is a boy right here. So let's see if this title lives up to its reputation. Hey there, this is Marin, and this is my review of Rui wa Tomo o Yobu.
Story.
The story begins when Tomo, the protagonist, receives a letter from his long-deceased mother containing a phone number and a message telling him to seek assistance from someone called Minamoto. However, one phone call later, he learns that the person he was looking for passed away many years ago and is then given an address where a supposed relative is living, an address that leads to a clearly abandoned building. Luckily for him, he meets there the pretty much homeless Minamoto Rui, who's just as befuddled by the letter's contents as Tomo is. However, just as they're racking their brains about the situation, a fire erupts, forcing them to escape to the building's rooftop, where they are ambushed by a mysterious biker. After managing to escape, they set out the next afternoon to seek the assailant and retaliate. A nearly impossible task, as they have no leads to follow, except that they happen to run into her by pure chance. Then a bunch of stuff happens, and that's how the gang gets together.
いや、飛ばしすぎだろう。
Alright, here's the quick rundown. A few days earlier, Rui and Hattori bumped into each other on the street and got into a fight. During it, Koyori, who was passing by, was caught in the altercation and sent flying. Unfortunately for her, she instinctively grabbed Hattori's bag and ran off with it. Once she had calmed down, someone else yanked the bag from her and vanished into the city. Jump to the current day. Rui and Tomo bump into Hattori while searching for her, where the two girls get into a fight once again. Just like last time, Koyori is unfortunate enough to be strolling around that same area. Cue the three of them chasing after Koyori. Tomo manages to catch up to her, but right then, they run into a couple of other girls, Iyo and Akaneko, who are being surrounded by a bunch of shady men. Apparently, Akaneko had just escaped from an orphanage she was put in after being sold to pay off her father's debt. In the end, all of them manage to escape together and decide to form a temporary alliance. Hattori would shelter the fugitive Akaneko and the homeless Rui, while everyone would help her find her precious book. As you can imagine, this group is the keystone of this work. Their chemistry is simply top-notch, thanks to their distinct personalities and how each of those personalities play specific roles in their dynamics. Conversations in Ruitomo feel almost multi-directional, where someone brings up a topic, then someone else, mostly Akaneko, says something absurd that derails the conversation. But instead of yanking it back to the original topic, they play around with that deviation until it eventually flows back to it organically. Now, while I generally don't like to reveal too much about the game's story, there's one more plot detail that I believe needs to be mentioned. Don't worry too much about spoiler stuff. I'm still intentionally leaving out a few important details. So, to be specific, all of them are bearers of a deadly curse, as evidenced by the mark they all carry on their bodies. So even though this game is quite slice-of-life lenient, the mystery behind the curse is always lurking underneath the lighthearted atmosphere. This foreboding contrast is one of Ruitomo's strongest points. You just never know when the curse will strike and interrupt the game's otherwise carefree tone. Yet these scenes never come across as cheap jump scares, largely because of how well integrated into the plot the curse as a whole is. Essentially, the curse prohibits them from doing a specific action unique to each one of them. More importantly, since they have carried the curse since a young age, this prohibition shaped their sense of self, becoming a defining element of their character and personality. At the same time, it is sort of presented like a chicken or the egg type of dilemma, with the conflicts in each route serving as a way to better understand how much their curses are responsible for their misfortunes, what type of relationship they have with these deadly burdens, and how they feel about them. Anyhow, this feels like the right spot to talk about the character routes. Structurally, you're first forced to play Rui's route, and once you finish it, the rest unlock, with the exception of Akaneko's route, which is only playable after completing all the previous ones. Also, while there's no specific route order, I strongly suggest following the same I did. Starting with the enforced first route, Rui's. Personality-wise, she's pretty much the total opposite of the far more methodical and pragmatic protagonist, having a far more carefree and spontaneous demeanor. However, her route is weird. And I don't mean that the events in her route are bizarre, but rather that it doesn't feel like a character route. It's more like an extension of the common route, if that makes any sense. It's a bit aimless at times, raising more questions than answers. It doesn't help that during the climax of the route, they completely set aside Rui's main conflict for something entirely different, which makes the eventual conclusion feel a bit underwhelming. What confuses me about this approach is that, she's the first girl the protagonist meets, has a lot of presence during the common route, and even her freaking name is in the title. She basically had main girl written all over her face. But I guess the game had other plans for her. Then again, as a setup for future routes, it does its job. But beyond that, it's not a particularly special route. Next up would be Atori, the haughty, arrogant, yet extremely charismatic Ojo-sama of the group. However, she does have a small personality quirk. Namely, she's a perv, and a pretty massive one at that. Her strong personality and antics often lead to clashes with the rest of the group, mostly with Rui. As for her route, it certainly leans far more into mystery than Rui's, with her precious book playing an important role. One thing I quite liked about this route is that whenever Atori lets her pride get the better of her, the MC doesn't act as a yes man, or in his case, a yes trap, I guess, and isn't afraid to tell her how things are. Also, this route did something near the end that I thought was very clever. Pretty solid route, all things considered. Following that comes Koyori's route. She's the cheerful and innocent member of the group, often receiving the short end of the stick from the group's usual hijinks. Despite being the youngest, she's probably one of the more sensible of the bunch. Also, I personally found very cute the way she happily zooms around with her rollerblades. One thing I really liked about her route, and the game as a whole, is that whenever something becomes obvious, it doesn't dwell on it. Like, how in your average VN it takes the protagonist 20 or something flashback scenes before it finally clicks? Well, in Rui Tomo, it's just one and done. Now that's efficiency. Moving on to the next girl, Iyo, I'll come clean and admit that I wasn't particularly looking forward to this route. She's the level-headed one, often seen by the group as the quintessential class rep, which works great for their dynamics, often trying and mostly failing to put some order in the chaos. But I wasn't sure her strengths would work as well solo. Luckily, I was proven wrong, since her rational and somewhat rigid values made for an interesting relationship with the protagonist. Likewise, her route presented a refreshing change of pace compared to the rest. Most of it takes place in a Western manner, which gives it the feel of a traditional mystery story. Also, regarding what I mentioned about the route order, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to leave this route for last. The revelations are massive, while also serving as a narrative bridge into Akaneko's route. Speaking of which, in many ways, Akaneko is the star of this title. Her personality is unlike anything I've seen in a VN, constantly saying outlandish stuff in the most bizarre way possible. Every time she goes,
OK、Akaneko-san理解しました。
it's safe to expect that she's going to interpret the situation in the worst way possible. Her route too is quite great and worthy of being the final true route. It's a route with considerable range, starting rather lightheartedly and gradually becoming more serious in anticipation of the finale. However, the best thing about it is how it incorporates elements from all previous routes, giving you the information needed to answer all the unanswered questions without condescendingly feeding you the solutions. As a whole, I feel like Tomo's biggest accomplishment is how it turns a vague and somewhat mystical idea, namely the curse, into something sound and tangible. By thoughtfully integrating it into its narrative, the game creates a compelling blend of many genres, while also enhancing the depth of its characters. It's perhaps not as openly ambitious as it could have been, but the relatively smaller scale, focusing instead on the intra- and interpersonal effects of the curse on these characters, makes this title as unique as it is deliberate. Before moving on, I want to quickly mention the writing and its complexity, since I've often seen the game cited as a hard-to-read title. For reference, JPDB lists it just one step below Saihat no Ima and above titles like Gunjo no Sora Okoete and Oretsuba. I can personally attest that the game doesn't mess around, at least in the first half. I got the feeling it became simpler as it progressed, but regardless, the writing was consistently strong. If you're wondering whether your Japanese is up to snuff, the second scene starts with a rather long letter, which is probably one of the most challenging parts of the game in terms of language complexity. If you can read that, you're good to go.
演出
Regarding the presentation, I was honestly considering not even bringing it up for this review, since pretty much every aspect of it was pretty good, but also not entirely remarkable. But then, while working on this video, I tried the game's fan disc, and hot damn what an improvement it is. Sprites look much cleaner while keeping the exact same art style. Scenes are way more dynamic, with well-placed camera shifts and other small visual touches, not to mention the far more detailed backgrounds. Hell, even the main menu got a notable upgrade. Kind of makes me wish they had remade the original game with these production values. Still, as I mentioned, there's nothing wrong with it, but it definitely pales in comparison to its fan disc.
まとめ
Overall, Rui wa Tomo o Yobu gets a strong recommendation from me. The game boasts an incredibly strong and charismatic group of characters, rivaling some of the best the genre has to offer. Its central mystery is not only well developed, but also seamlessly interwoven with the character writing, shaping their personalities and values. However, it's important to keep in mind that the heavy slice-of-life focus can make it feel, at times, like the mystery takes a back seat. Even so, the game does a fantastic job of subtly reminding you that it's always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Also, the game has a Kaneko, and she alone is enough of a reason to play this. I give Rui wa Tomo o Yobu an 8.5 out of 10. And that wraps up the first review of 2026. As I previously mentioned, I've been playing the game's fan disc, and while I'm probably not going to make a video about it, I do recommend giving it a shot after playing the base game. Even as someone who usually avoids fan discs, I can say that this is perhaps one of the better fan discs I've played. In a way, it feels like one of those expansions games used to get before the current DLC era. It almost feels like a full sequel. Also, as you might have guessed, this one is definitely going into the top 50 VNs. I'm thinking it should go just below Higurashi, making it the current 39th best VN I've played. Anyway, that's going to be it for the video. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Marin out.